as the culmination of their classical education. Thus was born the idea of the Grand Tour, a practice that introduced Englishmen, Germans, Scandinavians, and also Americans to the art and culture of France and Italy for the next 300 years. Travel was arduous and costly throughout the period, possibly only for a privileged class, the same that produced gentlemen, scientists, authors, antiquaries, and above all, patrons of the arts. The Grand Tour gave concrete form to Northern Europeans' ideas about the Greco-Roman world and helped foster neoclassical ideals. The most ambitious tourists visited excavated sites such as Pompeii and Herculaneum and Tivoli, and purchased antiquities to decorate their home. So these are some of the key points, kind of the time frame of this Grand Tour. It really flourished from about 1660 to the 1840s with the advent of rail. And it really was a rite of passage for so many young gentlemen. Although it was primarily associated with the British nobility, as I mentioned, Germans, Scandinavians, and even Americans went on this type of tour. And the primary value of the Grand Tour really lay in its exposure to the cultural legacy of classical antiquity in the Renaissance, and to the aristocratic and fashionably polite society of the European continent. We have to remember there really weren't museums at this point, and so you had to physically go to the artworks. There weren't recordings of sound, so if you wanted to hear Mozart, you had to go to Vienna. So it was really an idea for these young men, after graduating what was the equivalent to sort of a finishing school, they would go with their lecturer or their tutor on this education. And sometimes it would last 6 months, sometimes a couple of years. It all depended on how much money you had. I can't even imagine traveling for that long. It must have been amazing. The name of their tourist, or their tutor was a cicerone, a knowledgeable guide or tutor. So here's a map, essentially kind of where they would go. They'd start in Dover, and they'd cross over to Calais, and they'd head down Paris, Geneva, Turin, Genoa, Florence, Rome, Naples, sometimes over to Messina, and then back up. You can kind of see the route. Venice, usually over to up to Munich, over to Vienna, Berlin, Brussels, and then back across the border. It was really a treacherous travel. They had to cross several passages of the mountains, of the Alps, and as I said, it took a really long time for them to do it. And there were guidebooks, in addition to having your tutors that would kind of point out some things along the way. There were guidebooks such as seen on the screen at right, the Grand Tour. It was a description, and essentially it was kind of like the 18th century equivalent of Fodor's. It had all the high points, all the things that you absolutely must see, and you literally kind of went through and you checked them off to make sure that you saw them all. So some of the main kinds of art that artists would see and collect and bring back were landscapes. They were taking these souvenirs home with them. And Panini was one of the primary artists. We didn't talk about him the other day in depth, but he was an artist working in Rome, obviously, and one of the quintessential artists that these grand tourists were looking at. His topographical views of Rome are among the finest of the 18th century. The Piazza del Popolo that we've got on screen at left was the principal entry point into the city for travelers coming from the north, so that would have been something they would have first seen as they were coming in. In the center of the piazza is the red granite obelisk brought to Rome by the Emperor Augustus. And behind the obelisk, between the two churches, lies the Via del Corso, a major thoroughfare of the city. To the far left are the Villa Medici, today the seat of the French Academy, and the Church of Trinita dei Monti with its two towers. I've got these two up to really show you the two types of landscapes that Panini was really known for, topographical versus the ruins. As you can guess, the topographical landscape on the left really does accord to the geography and the plane of that city, whereas the ruins are more of an invention and an ideal that Panini would have had. The cult of ruins was almost an obsession with visitors to Rome and Italy, and it really allowed them to meditate on the decline of great civilizations like the Roman Empire. So there are these two kind of poles of examples of landscapes that the grand tourists are collecting. Canaletto and Guardi are two other artists that are really associated with grand tours, bringing back pictures from their time in Rome and Italy. If you're really kind of looking and comparing the two of them, I think that Guardi paints in a more spontaneous way than Canaletto. His brushwork is much more rapid and quick, more silvery than Canaletto. Canaletto's usually sort of convey a brighter sense of light and atmosphere. In terms of Guardi, in Canaletto, they were rivals. And although they're not in the same gallery now, I wanted to put them up to really kind of look at them side by side. As I said, images like these were purchased by tourists as mementos of Venice, a popular destination on the Grand Tour. And between Guardi's broad expanse of sky and water is the Dogana, or the customs house that we see at right, a reminder of Venice's centuries-old importance as a center of international trade. To its right is the Church of Santa Maria della Salute, built in the 17th century to honor the Virgin Mary, who was credited with stopping a plague epidemic that had killed nearly a third of Venice's population. And prints were another really popular item that grand tourists took back with them. We have a number of works by Piranesi, again, showing kind of a city in ruins. These were obviously much more affordable for grand tourists to take back and much more portable as well. They could pack these and take them with them as opposed to having to ship them back. Three artists that grand tourists would come across and see were Poussin, Rosa, and Claude Lorraine. And all of the artists that we're going to talk about in the English landscape tradition, Constable, Turner, and Gainsborough, all studied Claude Lorraine. And you'll see, as we talk about them later on, how he's influenced them in terms of the sense of light and composition. So moving into the English landscape, we're now moving into galleries P24 and P25, and a couple of sort of broad overarching points. And here I did combine landscapes from both of those galleries, P24 and P25, so we can really see a thread as we go through. Landscape has really been central to definitions of Englishness for centuries. It's a space where visions of the past, present, and future have met in debates over questions of national identity. And this really becomes important when we think about the hierarchical society of England, and if you're landed or not, if you're a landowner. It also maps onto the way they display themselves in portraits that we'll see in a few minutes when I talk about the difference between English portraits and French portraits. So this idea of landed gentry simply means that you own land. Landed gentry was different than landed nobility. The landed gentry was an historical British class consisting of landowners who usually didn't depend on any other income other than what they would receive in rent for their land. So they didn't have the taint of being a tradesman anymore. As soon as they started to own land and collect rent, they were encouraged to sell or get out of their business of trade because it was considered less than noble to be associated with being a tradesman. And then the landed nobility are higher. They're aristocrats who own land, and it was part of their noble privilege. And so if you were marrying someone, it came with an estate, a country house. It was all part of this general idea of a hierarchy in London, or in England, rather. The Enclosure Acts, as we'll see as we get to the 19th century, really had an impact on landscape, but also on the advent of the Industrial Revolution. There are Enclosure Acts, 1801 and 1845. So when you owned a tract of land, there were parts of it that were unused, whether it was at the edge of a cliff or an undesirable parcel of land. And locals would come in and they would work this land, and until there were these, and so they became a common property of anybody who didn't actually own that land. When they had these Enclosure Acts in 1801 and 1845, it changed the ownership of that land, and you had to then purchase it, or you had to own it. So they kicked out the tenant farmers who were farming that piece of land. So as we see with Constable, in particular later on, this is really going to have an impact on how shaping his vision of the landscape. And it displaced tenants and often left the countryside, who left the countryside to work in towns. There are three essential categories of landscape: the beautiful, the picturesque, and the sublime. And these are really sort of in order in terms of the poles. And there's a hyperlink down at the bottom that you can click that really kind of maps that onto 3 images of Niagara Falls. So the idea of landscape, these categories, existed in England and America. So a beautiful landscape would have everything in proportion, utility and perfection. So perfectly balanced on left and right, a serene sort of style, and it evokes a feeling of emotion of pleasure and delight. In the middle, between kind of the beautiful and the sublime, is the picturesque. And this contains some elements of wildness, irregularity, as opposed to symmetry and perfect proportion. So you might have a group of trees on one side and rocks on the other, so they're not completely balanced. But the last third of the 18th century, Enlightenment and rationalist ideas about aesthetics were being challenged by looking at the experiences of beauty and sublimity as non-rational. Aesthetic experience was not just a rational decision. One did not look at a pleasing curved form and decide it was beautiful. Rather, it came naturally as a matter of basic human instinct. And then at the opposite end of the spectrum from the beautiful is the sublime, something that causes astonishment, awe, terror, or horror. And nature was really increasingly seen as something that could produce that emotion in individuals. So in America, we think about the Rocky Mountains or the craggy cliffs of something extremely steep, or the vast expanses of the West, the untamed West. In England, we're going to think about cataclysmic weather or any kind of natural occurrence in nature, a storm or cliffs or something in which it dwarfs man. So the 3 kind of categories of landscape, and there were theorists behind them, William Gilpin, Immanuel Kant. These are all kind of theories that the artists kept in the back of their mind when they're producing these types of landscapes. And the 3 major exponents of these kinds of landscapes are Thomas Gainsborough, John Constable, and Joseph Mallory William Turner. So Gainsborough painted the sedate countryside of his native Suffolk, treating it more in the modest, naturalistic manner of 17th century Dutch landscape artists. And we'll see that in a minute when I compare some of the earlier works of his. So Gainsborough is looking more to Dutch than he is to French or Italian. Although he painted real places, landscapes were a form of release. So as we see momentarily, the 18th century really became a portrait painting age, and that was how artists could earn their bread and butter, including Gainsborough. But he really much preferred to paint landscapes because it allowed him to be a little bit more creative. It was not something he was necessarily getting paid for, but it allowed him more intellectual freedom. And again, we think back to that model of the French Academy. The same hierarchies existed in the Royal Academy. So history painting was up at the top, anything you could use your mind for. Whereas if you get down to copying, landscape or still life, that becomes lower because you're not using your mind. So Gainsborough wanted to use his mind instead of just copying or looking directly to create a portrait. In fact, he wrote to a friend, quote, "I'm sick of portraits and wished very much to take up my viol de gamme," he played an instrument, "and walk off to some sweet village where I can paint landscapes." And when he couldn't, he simply made them up, using little mise-en-scène of meres for water, coal for rocks, moss for greenery, and broccoli for trees. So he would create these little kind of still lifes in his own studio because he just loved painting landscapes so much. Constable lived in the same area of England as Gainsborough did. He was a fellow East Anglian, and he was sort of more thoroughgoing. For all of his admiration of Claude, he refused to be always running after pictures and seeking the truth at second hand. He painted the places he loved best. So in other words, he painted his own surroundings of his countryside in East Anglia. In fact, there's a place called Constable Country, and there's a footpath that you can kind of travel all around where he painted. Because he believed that no 2 leaves of a tree were ever alike since the creation of the world, his method was very close and minute observation of nature. His blood and soil approach did not endear him to the Royal Academy, which objected to his refusal to elevate his subject matter. In other words, he painted what he saw exactly copying leaf for leaf, as opposed to somebody else who's inventing elements of history or mapping some of those ideas onto the landscape. His work shows not just his fidelity to the changing appearance of nature, but his emotional attachment to the countryside of his birth. Turner, by contrast, started as a topographer before picking up his Claudian inheritance, whereas Gainsborough called figures in landscape paintings a little business for the eye. In other words, you've got to put them in there because that's what people are going to expect. Turner saw them as intrinsic to his picture's meaning. Constable never left England, but Turner traveled far and wide, going across Italy, France, and Switzerland for grand landscapes that he could treat in a classicizing manner. A foreground tree framing some human figures, a middle distance with a river or castle for interest, and a distant blue horizon. So, as I said, Gainsborough was always looking at Lorraine and saw his work early on in his career. And part of the elements that he was looking at were this idyllic sense of nature, this Arcadian vision that we talked about when we talked about Lorraine the other day. And what I mentioned specifically was that clawed glass. And I was going to circle back around to that. So the clawed glass was this invention named after Claude Lorraine that allowed artists, and you can see this beautiful sketch on the far left by Gainsborough, it allowed artists to work with it, and it would take away some of the reflection from the landscape. It really sharpened things into focus, and it also became kind of a fun thing for people to go out into the landscape and hold and just show different visions of the landscape, as you see from this detail of a portrait in the middle. The glass consisted of a slightly convex blackened mirror, which was carried in the hand and held up to the eye. The image thus was seen was the scenery behind rather than in front of the user. The mirror's convexity reduced extensive views to the dimensions of a small drawing. The use of a blackened rather than an ordinary silvered mirror resulted in a somewhat weakened reflection, which stressed the prominent features of the landscape and at the expense of detail. It also lowered the color key. A larger version of this device is said on occasion to have been fixed to the windows of horse-drawn carriages in order to reflect the passing scenery. So some of these Dutch routes that we have here that we'll see kind of mapping on some of the English landscapes are a very ordered composition. Usually 2/3 of a composition is taken up by sky. And you're really going to get a detailed observation of nature. So again, every single leaf, you're going to be able to identify the genus and species of any flowers in the foreground, just a minute attention to detail. And they're going to look at native scenery. So like Gainsborough and Constable, they're going to paint their native area, unlike Turner, who's going to go off to Italy and farther afield. And it became very much kind of a sense of nationalism that they would paint only their native scenery. So some Dutch paintings in the English gallery that sort of suggest these Dutch roots are this portrait of the stallion Gillibrand by Charles Towne. If you go up to that canvas, you can, again, in the foreground, identify every single leaf and flower and twig in that painting. There's sap flowing from the trees. It's something that's definitely studied from nature directly. It is Charles Towne's native landscape in the north of England. And when I was considering putting this painting in the installation, it hadn't been on view, I don't think, really ever in its history of being at the Nelson Atkins. But it's just so English, not only because of the landscape, but because of the horse and its connection to horse racing that made me want to put it in the installation. But again, this is a painting that's definitely looking at the Dutch roots of landscape. With Gainsborough, his early work looks back to the Dutch roots. So this early landscape on the right from 1747, again, like the town, suggests that minute observation of nature. 2/3 of the composition is sky. We have the native landscape. But his later work, such as the painting that we have in our collection from 1777 to 8, heads kind of more in the Flemish tradition. So it's higher keyed colors. The brushwork becomes a little bit looser. There's more drama happening. I wish we had an earlier landscape. We have some drawings, but the late landscape's great. But I think one of the things that I really want to stress today is even though we're moving closer and closer towards modernism, these artists are still always going to be looking back. And the Dutch tradition is really something that they're going to continue to look back at, as well as French landscapes. With Constable, he, again, as I was saying, paints in his native countryside. And I love this quote: "'Tis the most delightful country for a landscape painter. I fancy I see Gainsborough in every hedge and hollow tree. It haunts my mind and clings to my heart." As I mentioned, there's Constable Country, and this particular map on the right shows Helmingham Hall, where he painted this composition. He painted it several times throughout his life. He made sketches early on and then came back to the theme 30 years later. In fact, the Helmingham Park is known for these massive oak trees, and the oak tree that we see in the painting is actually still there today. That's a picture of it at the far right. Although the bridge has changed, the oak remains. Constable was one of the first artists who really went outside and studied nature directly, and this is going to really have a thread to the Impressionists. He was a budding meteorologist. He would go out and study the clouds, such as this cloud study reveals, and inscribed on the back of the painting is 27 August, 11 o'clock noon, looking eastward, large silvery clouds, wind gentle at southwest. That's pretty detailed description of nature. He would make countless studies of the clouds, and then he would come back and work in his studio on his landscapes. He was passionate also about Claude Lorraine, and there's a quote that I'm not, let's see, where did it go? He talked about, with his wife, he said, "I do not wonder at your being jealous of Claude. If anything could come between our love, it is him." So he studied him constantly and was always going, he didn't go to Rome, but he was constantly kind of trying to adopt and adapt some of the things that he saw in Claude's landscape. So as I mentioned, that idea of the enclosures and really displacing a lot of workers from the countryside into the city, one of the things that Constable takes from Claude is that idea of that Arcadian or idyllic landscape. I put this picture up of Manchester, England on the right because it's more or less the same time frame in which Constable is painting these idyllic landscapes, when in reality there would have been factories that were in the background, smoke rising up. It would have been a very different landscape than what Constable pictures it as. So that's that Claudian link. He's idealizing the landscape, even though he's painting, he's trying to record nature, he is idealizing it, which links us back to Claude, because it very much was that shift in that moment of heightened industrial activity in England. So it was a very different picture than what we see Constable picturing. Moving on to Turner. Turner, believe it or not, also looked back to Ruysdael, and yet the Impressionists are going to look back to him. And one of the reasons that kind of connects all of these dots is the ability to convey atmospheric sensibility. The way that light comes through the clouds, that's something that Turner is doing that Monet is going to look back to. But Turner's looking back to the Dutch artists. He was so enamored of the Dutch artists that he started naming some of his paintings after Ruysdael. We can see that our composition is very close to a painting by Ruysdael called Storm Off of the Seacoast, also known as The Breakwater from 1670. And I think it's very interesting that Van Gogh owned a print of that Ruysdael work as well. So we see again these connections back to the Dutch tradition of landscape. These are two works by Turner, as I said, that in which he's called these fictive ports after Ruysdael, again showing his sort of homage to this artist of the 17th century. On the left, at Yale Center for British Art, a painting called Port Ruysdael. There's, of course, no such port that exists. And on the right, fishing boats bringing a disabled ship into Port Ruysdael. Again, a subtle, well, maybe not so subtle nod to his acknowledged master. And as I said, one of the things that Turner's really great at doing, and this is a fairly early work in his career, if you go to the Tate and you see all of the Turners, he gets so loose and brushy towards the end of his career. They very much look like proto-impressionist pictures. This is much earlier, more realistic, and again, he's able to really communicate a sense of weather and the clouds parting and the storm off in the distant horizon. And his people, as I said earlier, really meant something to him, the way he's communicating the effects of the weather, the women's scarf that's blowing off into the wind, and how cold it is. The cheeks are red, the nose of the figure, the man in the left foreground is red as well. This was a known port, and there are drawings at the Tate that show that there was no actual port, that the fishing ships came into the beach and then the merchants went out and met the ship to bring in the goods, and then they would sell them on the beach itself directly. As I said, while Turner's looking back to the Dutch tradition, Monet will look back towards Turner. We'll talk about that a little bit later when we get into the Impressionist section, but Monet was in London along with several other artists during the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, and there was a major Turner exhibition in 1871, which is when he saw these works firsthand. And there's a painting that he did while he was in London and looking directly at Turner. That's this 1871 canvas at the National Gallery in London on the Thames below Westminster. And this is the landscape that really kind of is evocative of that sublime feeling that I mentioned, something that causes or evokes terror or awe in the viewer. This is by an artist named Sebastian Pether, and it's the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. Naples was definitely a destination on the Grand Tour, and artists and young men alike would go down and visit the city. It was a very active volcano. It erupted 6 times in the 18th century and 8 times in the 19th century. So it really became this spectacle in a way similar to kind of Old Faithful. People went to go see it and see it erupt from a safe distance. The detail at the lower right is these visitors who are onlookers who are looking from a safe distance at the erupting Mount Vesuvius. It hasn't erupted since 1944. However, if it did, it would be something absolutely terrible. I think there are over 600,000 people who live within the flow zone of Vesuvius. Moving on to the English face and portraiture. Let's see how I'm doing on time here. When we think of English portraits, we often think back to these sort of Tudor and Stuart period portraits of noblemen, of kings and queens. And for the most part, that was the tradition. Up until the mid-17th century, it was foreign artists like Holbein or Lely depicting English nobility. So that really said 2 things to you. Number 1, portrait painting was reserved for the aristocracy. And number 2, there weren't any British artists that were good enough to paint the royals, or so that was the conception. So we have these foreign artists, as I said, like Holbein and Lely, that are really, they become the court painters to the king and queen of England, kings and queens of England. Portraiture was a very formal genre, and it was not only to capture a likeness of an individual, obviously, it also served a propagandistic purpose as well. There are countless images of Henry VIII and that circulated widely, not only in oil, but also in print. And again, this kind of furthered his power and part of his reign. The same with Queen Elizabeth. And portraits of the nobility really kind of carried all the way through until the reign of Charles II. And we start to see some of his mistresses, including the portrait on the right of Barbara Villiers, the Duchess of Cleveland. And this is about the same time that we start to see a shift in who follows who in terms of the fashions. So before this point, everybody looked to the court, the queens and kings, to set the fashion and to follow. And starting around the mid-17th century, when Charles had all his mistresses depicted, people start to follow what their sense of fashion is. It also starts a shift in the idea of wearing makeup at court. It used to be associated with the lower prostitutes, and then when the mistresses kind of came into court, it sort of elevated along with them as well. And so we're going to start seeing people who have full makeup on their faces in the portraits. So some of the key points about portraiture: it has always played a dominant role in England since the Renaissance, when the arts reclaimed the legitimacy of the Tudor dynasty, while the Protestant Reformation affected drastic decline in commissions for religious images. So again, we've got to think about that we're not getting these church commissions anymore, so portraits are really kind of starting to displace that. A relatively stable monarchy in concert with a powerful landed aristocracy provided continuity and patronage. But patronage starts to really widen and shift. As we get into the 18th century, with the opening of the Royal Academy, we have the first sort of public space where portraits can see and be seen. People are milling about, and it's really this public exhibition space that forever changes the way portraiture is not only painted, but also received. Artists are starting to sell their works. Other than having direct commissions from the queens and kings, they're getting commissions for portraits, and this really forever shifts things. The shifting economy also opens it up to people below the crown and court. So we're going to see people who are like actresses and courtesans and less than the aristocrats having their portraits painted, all as sort of a sign of their status in society. So I wanted to talk briefly about some of the differences between French and English portraiture, and it relates back to landscape painting tradition. So I put two pairs of pictures up here, French and English. Left to right, we've got the English portrait by Joseph Wright of Derby of Sir George Cook. That's painted outside. And then next to it, the L'Abbé Guillard, Joachim Le Bertrand, is inside. And the same pair goes for the right to the French portrait is a woman inside, and the English portrait is outside. As I said, land was so central to the English understanding of an equation of wealth and status that more or less, I mean, there are certainly exceptions to the rule, English are going to be pictured outside. Or if they're inside, there's going to be a window that shows outside. Because they want you to know, no matter what, that they have money, that they own land, and these portraits are really their business cards, their calling cards of that wealth and status. It becomes so important in the mid-century, mid-18th century. Again, when I said that the shifting economy, and it's such a hierarchical society that they really are advertising themselves and their wealth. Let's see. So commissioned portraits. This has got to be the most smug expression on a face ever. And I think it sort of perfectly exemplifies the English face. As I said, commissioned portraits are becoming more of a thing in the 18th century, and this point painting is no exception. This portrait celebrates the succession of Sir George Cook to the 7th baronetcy of Wheatley Hall, an English estate, in 1776, so the year that this is painted. Portraits, as one might expect, are often commissioned on the occasion of something, so it's celebrating a marriage, in this case, a succession. So they're really kind of commissioned to signal a shift, a life-changing event. The same year that this portrait was commissioned, Cook also purchased a commission in the Royal Regiment of Horse Guards, one of the most expensive in the British Army. So if you didn't have a title, you could buy a title. It's true, the money could buy just about anything, even then. In the painting, Cook appears as a veteran emerging from the smoke of battle, an unlikely position for a recently enlisted 21-year-old of junior rank. So again, he's really projecting himself forward into something he wants to be, and because it is a commission, the painter, Joseph Wright of Derby, had to accord with his wishes. As I said, artists need to get paid, and this is a very lucrative branch of painting, and they were dependent upon the successful commissions, and so they had to please their patron at all costs. And we're really going to see that as we talk about our next portrait. I'm going to forewarn you, I may ruin this painting for you, but I just think it's such an interesting story, this full-length portrait by John Hopner of Emily St. Clair as a Bacchante figure, painted in 1807. Actually, I think that's supposed to be 1806 to 1807. It was commissioned by commissioned by John Lester, seen at the right in a portrait of him after James Northcote and Joshua Reynolds. He was a colonel of the yeomanry, and he was also quite a collector. He collected many, many paintings of the English school and displayed them in his central London house. He was the suitor of this woman, a young woman, Emily St. Clair, from the time she was age 12 to 16. It's a little hard to swallow now, but that was acceptable at that time. One of the first things I noticed when I arrived in Kansas City was I looked at the credit line for this painting, and it was given by the Lehman Brothers in New York. And I wondered, why would the Lehman Brothers be giving the Nelson Atkins a painting? And it turns out that during the war years, many institutions sent their paintings to the Nelson Atkins to safe harbor them because we didn't yet have a full collection. And so as a thank you gift, as a gesture for offering safe harbor to paintings in New York, Lehman's gave the Nelson Atkins this full-length painting by John Hopner. Now, Hopner was a portrait painter to the king, to George IV, and he's really known for his beautiful kind of tight compositions of classical women that are very kind of upstanding and classically beautiful. We don't see that in the Hopner portrait of Emily St. Clair. It's painted completely differently. It's very loose. It's very gestural. It is a scene. All the sensibility is different than what he normally would paint. Again, it's a commission portrait, and so Hopner was listening to John Lester in the commission. And the figures at the back, to kind of communicate the scene, really communicate a lot about the sitter. She obviously was a young woman, 12. At this point, she was about 14, and the inclusion of this figure in her kind of positioning as this bacchanalian figure suggests that she liked to have a good time, and it's communicated in the subject matter in the background, but also everything about it kind of communicates in the way that Hopner is addressing the theme. Lester had 13 portraits painted of Emily St. Clair. You could say he was rather obsessed with her. And her identity had been lost until the late 80s when a scholar was able to reconnect some of the prints after these portraits to the individual Emily St. Clair. And most of them, she's appearing in various guises. So we have at the far left the dumb alphabet. She is posing as a gypsy girl, an alpine traveler, and my personal favorite, she's a falconer at the far right. All of these in different guises, again, kind of showing her many facets of her personality. And to think about having all of these, and plus, 10 or so more pictures, many of which are full length, gives you a sense of the scale of the house that he had, because not only did he commission 13 portraits of her, but he collected paintings by Gainsborough and Constable and Lorraine and Duguay and Rosa, all of which he had in this one home. So the other woman. John Lester was with Emily St. Clair from, as I said, from ages 12 to 16, and when he left her for another woman who was 16, Lady Lester at the right, Georgiana, Lady Lester at the far right, the canvases of Emily St. Clair were cut out of their frames, rolled up, and sold without a name. And so our painting was sold as the Tambourine Girl. So her identity had been lost, as I said, for so many years, until the 1980s, as I said, when the scholar kind of reconnected the dots. But he did marry Georgiana, Lady Lester, and this is a portrait of her as Hope from the 19th century. We do know that Emily St. Clair was given a pension, sort of hush money to be quiet and go away, and she took it, and that was, again, part of what was par for the course during the period. One of my favorite portraits in the room is Nathaniel Dance Holland's unfinished portrait of Jeremiah Meyer. This portrait also has not been on view for quite some time before coming out for the block reinstallation. Jeremiah Meyer was a miniature painter, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And Nathaniel Dance painted a number of portraits of other fellow members of the Royal Academy. He, along with Jeremiah Meyer, were among the first group of people who were part of the Royal Academy that opened in 1768. Here we see Meyer kind of posed over his sketchbook, and I love some of these details. He's kind of scrubbed in the background coat, and we see that his brush was so loaded with that umber paint that he's going to dash in and would have colored the coat, that it's dripped in that detail at the bottom left, or bottom right rather. You see that drip that the just came right off of the brush. It might be hard to see here, but around Holland's head is a larger kind of, I don't know, pyramid shape. Dance likely, when he was painting in the composition, delimited a space for the head, and so he left that part darker. It's even harder to see in the full length. But artists oftentimes would paint from upper right to bottom left and sort of leave a spot in the composition to put in that figure. And or it could be a suggestion of moving the picture from one side to the other. But I just love it, and I love that it speaks to process. Again, you see kind of how he works in the background and then scrubs in that outline. Many artists, not Dance, had studio assistants, and the main artist would just paint the head and the hands, and other artists would come in and paint the drapery. So that, not in this case, but in many other cases, that was how an artist would work if they had a large studio practice. As I mentioned, Jeremiah Meyer was a miniature painter, and I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about our amazing portrait miniature collection that I'm working on with Blythe Sobel in the foreground here. Portrait miniatures are some of the most, I just absolutely love them. They are the 18th century and 17th century equivalent of sort of cell phone selfies. And some of the ways in which they were worn, these are two portraits that show the image at the left, Queen Charlotte's wearing one on her wrist of George, and the image on the right by Philippe Jean, you see that she is wearing her loved one around her neck. These are intimate tokens of exchange, whether through love, loss, or memory. And we have a collection from the Starr family in Kansas City who are still active, and we are working on a catalog. So in 3 years, we will have a catalog of all these portrait miniatures. The way they were displayed was often in a cabinet, and this is an example of Horace Walpole's cabinet. He had a collection of about 100 miniatures, so he would keep them in this display case and open them. As I'll talk in a minute, they were very susceptible to light and fading, so they would keep the doors closed because they're watercolor. And as I showed you in the slide previously, another way was to wear them on your body, inside, close to your heart. The collection is known for having the most comprehensive collection of works by John Smart, British artist who lived from 1741 to 1811. We have at least one signed example for every year that he worked, which is amazing. So we have the earliest portrait in the collection is from when he was 19 years old, it's 1760, and you see a kind of a rather mask-like face. And at the far right, a painting, a drawing done the year that he died in 1811 when he was 71 years old. He had sort of three phases of his career: his early career in London, and then he moved to India at a midpoint in his career, and we've got a portrait of Muhammad Ali, sort of the governor of Arcot in the middle. And again, it's really a unique aspect of this collection to have such a comprehensive group of works by John Smart. Some of the techniques of a miniature painting, the earliest miniatures that you have on display right now are watercolor on vellum from the 17th century. They were, it's a calf skin, a fine animal or calf skin, and they were adhered to a playing card to give it some support, and then burnished with a dog's tooth. And in the example on the bottom, it's showing some of the pigments that artists were using at that point. That is a red pigment in its natural form. And in the middle, it's prepared, and they would always put the pigments in these mussel shells and then dab with these little tiny squirrel hair brushes, most of which were attached to quills. And so the painting at the far right is by Nicholas Hilliard, and that was done in this technique, and it's on vellum. A couple of detailed examples of the Hilliard, which is on view right now for another month and a half. It goes off view in March, so please go take a look at it. He's one of the most exquisite painters in the 17th century, and there's a motto at the top that Fulmen aquesque thero, I bear light and water. And this is George Cumberland, by the way. I don't have it. And he was one of the Queen's favorites, and he's wearing her armor. And there's a detail at the bottom of the double E cipher for Elizabeth. And if you happen to be in New York, the actual suit of armor is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. As we move into the mid-18th century, here we have to think again about Jeremiah Meyer. Watercolor on ivory was the next kind of method that artists who were portrait miniatures employed, but ivory was a very greasy medium or substrate, and watercolor, obviously, water and oil don't mix. So Jeremiah Meyer was really pioneering the way in which to get that watercolor to stick onto the ivory. So he would roughen up the surface with the file and give it a little more tooth, and that allowed the watercolor to stick onto the ivory. Artists were also adding a binding agent called gum arabic to the watercolor to make it a little more sticky as well to adhere to that surface. At the upper left is an ivory tusk, and is shown a piece of it that's cut off in the raw, and then in the upper central is prepared ivory. And one of the reasons that they would use ivory, that they did use ivory, is that it would mimic some of the skin tones, and you can see with the piece that's behind it, it was actually transparent a little bit. So it would catch light. They would put a piece of foil behind it, so it would catch the light of the foil and shimmer. By the mid-18th century, there were also commercially prepared pigments, and so you have a color box at the bottom that was actually belonged to George Engelhardt. And example by Jeremiah Meyer that is in our own collection. The third method of materials for portrait miniatures are enamel, and the next rotation that we have going into the case is formed from fire, and features all enamel miniatures. And the substrate was enamel on gold, copper, or porcelain. These were much more stable than watercolor on either vellum or ivory because they were fired, they weren't susceptible to fading. So all of the watercolor miniatures have a very low level of light that you can show these under, or else they'll be susceptible to fade. Enamel are fired, and they go through many processes. Each color has a different temperature to fire onto, and so they had to fire something for every single color is another firing. Henry Bone was really one of the premier artists who pioneered this medium, and at the far right is this example of George Washington, and it's a little tough to see, but there's a crack that runs through the center of George Washington, and Washington accepted it, and on the back of the miniature it says, "Crack occurred during the 5th firing, accepted by Setter." So he liked that as part of the process of making it. So moving on to the next gallery, Drama, Emotion, and Nature. Some of the key points are that artists here are emphasizing sense and emotions, not simply reason and order. They were equally important means of understanding and experiencing the world. They celebrated the individual imagination and intuition in the enduring search for individual rights and liberty. And Romanticism embraced the struggles for freedom and equality and the promotion of justice. Painters began using current events and atrocities to shed light on some of these injustices in dramatic compositions that rivaled the most staid neoclassical history paintings accepted by the national academies. So one of the first pictures that we come into, and it's interesting, we have a number of small pictures in this gallery that are studies for larger compositions. At left is our painting by Eugene Delacroix, Christ on the Sea of Galilee, and there are at least 7 other versions of this composition. The version at right is considered to be the first version, and ours is the first version. The one at the right in Portland is the second version. And there are some subtle differences between the two. Delacroix was a leading advocate of Romanticism, and he was fascinated by the struggles of man and nature and favored these dramatic, emotional scenes over classical subjects. The painting depicts Jesus sleeping peacefully while his panicked disciples weather a violent storm. Delacroix painted at least, as I said, 7 variations on the biblical theme, but ours is considered the first. And again, that all of the drama with the diagonal composition, some of these elements make us think back to the Baroque period with that dynamism, things set at an angle, wild motions and bright colors. Delacroix was looking back to some of the color compositions of the Baroque painters, but also Van Gogh is going to look back to him as well for this sort of brilliant sense of color and these juxtapositions of strong color contrasts. This painting by Géricault also was a study for something, although it was not completely realized. We just have a sketch. It was a compositional sketch for a larger work that depicts the legendary episode of early Roman history. Lucretia, the bare-breasted woman in the foreground, commits suicide after being raped by the son of the Etruscan king of Rome. Her kinsman Brutus vows revenge on the king's family, while several other men pledge their solidarity with outstretched arms. Although classical in theme, it is romantic in spirit through Theodore Géricault's rich yet moody palette that stems from his interest in Baroque painting from the 1600s. And here is, I thought I had a sketch of that. Must possibly not. We have, there is a sketch that is related to this work, but there is no finished composition that we are aware of. So again, this was this esquisse, this small sketch that would have been given for approval in the process of creating a much larger work. There are a few paintings that are in the corner that speak to the themes of Orientalism, and this was a popular theme in the 18th and early 19th century. The Orient, and what I mean by that, includes present-day Turkey, Greece, and the Middle East, and North Africa. And it really extended its influence on the Western imagination after Napoleon went to Egypt in Africa with his campaigns, military campaigns. In 1798, he was in Egypt, and he was there until 1801. And then in 1809, there was a 24-volume description of Egypt that filtered back with all of the discoveries that he was making, and the people that he was seeing, the things that he was encountering. And these volumes influenced a generation of artists, and you started to see some of these themes percolate through their work. There was just this fascination with this far-off and exotic land. Some of the first 19th century Orientalist paintings were intended as propaganda in support of French imperialism, depicting the East as a place of backwardness and lawlessness or barbarism, enlightened and tamed by French rule. Here we have 2 paintings in our collection, the Schreier, the Arab horseman from the 1860s, and Eugene Fromentin, a ravine, the souvenir of Algeria. Both of these artists actually did travel to Algeria. Schreier was there once in 1861 and came back and painted a number of these paintings featuring Arab horsemen. In a way, they become almost formulaic, but they were extremely popular with collectors alike who were hungry for this type of imagery. Whereas Fromentin actually made 3 trips to Algeria and was really a keen observer of the locals who were there. We have this beautiful black and white sketch in our collection. At the far right, the Arabs carrying serving dishes and cooking utensils. And he would take some of these figures from these sketches and populate them in his canvases, such as the case with the large picture that we have from 1874 in the center. Moving on to the next gallery, Naturalism in the Grand Tradition. And here we really have kind of one side versus the other side. It's the realism versus the academic. And these two styles could not be more diametrically opposed. On the one hand, it's painting what one sees, the naturalism, as opposed to idealizing the subject matter, which is the academic side. Many of the naturalist painters in the Barbizon are working outside initially to capture nature directly, whereas artists who are associated with the academics, the French Academy, are painting inside their studio, or they're remembering things or imagining things in their mind, thinking back to Lorraine or Poussin or these classical idealizing landscapes of their 17th century counterparts. And the brushwork is also very different from the academic side to the realist side. The academic side is going to be very tight and controlled. And I mentioned the other day that the French Academy not only dictated the subject matter and sort of with that hierarchy of genres, but they also really informed the color palette and the brushwork. It's a very tightly controlled organization, and the brushwork followed suit. Whereas the naturalists and the Barbizon painters are much more free in their application of paint. It's very brushy, it's loose, it's gestural, completely the opposite of the academic tradition of painters. And right out of the gates, I wanted to set up this contrast between Bouguereau on the left and Millet on the right. Bouguereau was the absolute pinnacle of the French Academy, and everything about him was in line with kind of the generalizations I'm making about the French Academy. He said that he only painted beauty, and for him, this idealized woman at the fountain was beautiful. This was a model who probably never touched a milk pail in her life or a water jug, and yet he's painting this kind of idea of this sort of rustic peasant out in nature, whereas in reality it was painted in his studio. Bouguereau, as I said, was a French academic painter, and in his realistic genre paintings he used many mythological themes, making modern interpretations of classical subjects, with an emphasis on the female human body. He was incredibly popular during his own life and in France and the United States, and he was given numerous official honors and received top prices for his work. As the quintessential salon painter of his generation, he was really absolutely despised by the Impressionists. So there was definitely, on the one hand, he was getting paid a lot and highly recognized, and just a few years later, as we'll see in the second half of today's presentation, the Impressionists were completely in the opposite direction, not getting praise at all. So they absolutely just hated him. So a lot of early museums, or a lot of museums in the early part of the 20th century, collected Bouguereau across the United States and Europe. A lot of New York institutions were collecting him, major institutions around the coast, but then he fell out of favor with the public, due in part to changing tastes. And it wasn't until the 1980s that there was a revival of interest in his figure painting that led to kind of a rediscovery of his work. And there was most recently an exhibition about a year ago that really looked at how institutions across America collected him and how that speaks to an era of taste that was better for him at the earlier part of the century. He was really, one of the quintessential questions is, was he the greatest academic painter ever? And although I'm not a fan in general of his work, I do feel like he was an extremely skilled painter. His brushwork is, as we'll see in a few details, extremely precise. He really clearly has a solid understanding of draftsmanship, again, something that came out of the French Academy in his training. Throughout the course of his life, he is known to have finished 822 paintings, although the whereabouts of many of them are still unknown due to his falling out of taste. And as the opposite kind of end of things, we have the Millet painting presenting a woman pouring milk. And this was kind of the realist side, the realist tradition. For Millet, he identified with the peasants. This was a time in France where there were peasants that were uprising and leading a revolt. and there were real class struggles, and you feel that sense in works by Millet and his contemporaries. Whereas Bouguereau, you have no sense of what's happening in French history at all. It's this kind of idyllic Arcadian vision of the past with no sense of what's happening in French society. So two opposite poles of beauty and two different ideas of beauty. As I said, Bouguereau really thought that he only would paint beautiful things, and for him it was this classicizing beauty of the Italian woman at the fountain, whereas Courbet's definition of beauty was a little more rugged and earthly. This is a portrait of a woman called Jo, the beautiful Irish woman, that Courbet painted at least 4 times. This is from 1866. Courbet was a French painter who led the realist movement in the 19th century, and Courbet was really committed to painting only what he could see. He rejected the academic conventions of Bouguereau and his colleagues and the romanticism of the previous generation of visual artists. So he really, as I said, only painted exactly what he felt he was seeing. His independence set an example for artists that followed him, such as the Impressionists and even the Cubists. And he really occupies an important place in 19th century French painting as an innovator and an artist willing to make bold social statements with his work. His paintings of the late 1840s and 50s brought him his first recognition, and they challenged conventions by depicting unidealized peasants and workers, often on a grand scale, traditionally reserved for paintings of religious or historical subjects. And I think these two portraits really kind of show you kind of the difference of how these artists not only were conceived or were received rather, but how they conceived of themselves. On the left, a self-portrait by Bouguereau, and on the right, a self-portrait by Courbet. They could not be more different senses of self. On the left, again, this really tightly controlled, highly finished, academic-style painting of Bouguereau. Again, the pinnacle at the highest heights of the French Academy, and Courbet, who just did everything that flew in the face of the French Academy. He was a rebel, only painted what he saw, and he looks like he just, he didn't care what anybody thought. So back to Courbet more specifically in this painting of Jo, Courbet really felt that painting must be of his or her own time. And that was something that Baudelaire was saying about modern life, and that's something that Courbet is really mapping onto. This was the woman that he knew. He painted her. She visited him with Whistler, and she was Whistler's, at the time, girlfriend. But Courbet won her over, and she became his girlfriend and served as a model for many of his other pictures. But she was known for her beautiful red hair, and we see that in this composition with her just pulling out these languorous curls. And again, she's not a classical beauty, but she is someone who's this rugged kind of peasant woman. It was said that she sang Irish tunes the whole time that he was painting her, and so again, you're getting that sense of her ruggedness and her earthiness in this composition. Courbet is really known for this massive composition, the Burial Ornans. Again, he's taking this ideal, or this subject of everyday life, a burial, and he's elevating it to the level of a history painting, not only because of the scale, but just the subject matter, which completely flew in the face of the French Academy. Again, something that we don't think of as radical today. These little moments start to kind of chip away at the French Academy, and this was kind of one of the first chinks in the armor here. It's history painting about real life. He's painting peasants, as he said, at their Sunday best. And that really was completely radical at the time. Again, some more quotes. The beauty of a redhead whose superb portrait I have begun. But as I said, beauty was a relative term during that period between the definitions of the French Academy and those of the realists. And again, this painting by Millet of peasants. And I think due to time, I'll just skip because I've got a couple more to go through. I wanted to pull these two up as examples of sculpture that kind of show and highlight these diametric oppositions between the realist tradition and the academic tradition. On the left is the Hamo Thornycroft mower, which is a reduced model of a larger-than-life-size bronze that was done by Thornycroft, and on the right, the very academic Jules Dalou standing bather. And the mower was considered absolutely radical when it was when the original life-size plaster model was exhibited in 1884. While examples of the British laboring class had appeared in painting before, this was the first time it ever appeared in sculpture. And so no one ever before had depicted a sculpture of a figure in working clothes. And while I think it's really interesting that this is the first time that this is done, he's clearly kind of dipping one toe in that pool of being radical by showing this figure in these peasant clothes. But if you look at the body, it's very classical. It's got that contrapposto stance with that great S-curve, and it just happens to have peasant clothing on. So he's being radical, but yet he's couching it in that tradition that people would have been used to. It's now recognized, this particular work, The Mower, as one of Thornycroft's most iconic pieces, and we're really fortunate to have it in our collection. In contrast to the sculpture by Jules Dalou, you get where we're going at this point. It's that realist versus that academic. It's that rugged versus that ideal. And Dalou is no exception. He's looking back to earlier models of Greek and Roman sculptures, in particular the Venus Pudica, for his classicizing sculpture of the standing bather. And he's looking at this modest Venus in which the goddess attempts to cover her naked body with her hands in drapery. While the subject of Dalou's idealized treatment of the body continues classical traditions, her softly modeled and curled hair really kind of speaks to Rococo sensibilities, and her delicate facial features all reflect the influence of French Rococo models of the 1700s. And this was a huge invention of the period that forever changed the course of art history and painters, the invention of the portable paint tube. At the far left, if painters wanted to paint outside, they had to take these bladders that were actually bladders from an animal, and they were used before 1840, and you have to pick them, squeeze out the paint, that hole would dry up, you have to pick another hole, squeeze it out. It was very cumbersome, and it really didn't facilitate artists working outside at all. The next invention, kind of going left to right, was kind of more of a syringe type application of paint. This was invented by an American oil painter, John Goffey Rand, as a way to transport paints outside. They were syringes that were glass that were used to squeeze out paint, and it preserved it for a longer time. That gave artists a little more flexibility and the possibility of a larger palette as colors took longer to perish. But the real invention was that metal paint tube, so they're not going to break, and they're much lighter to carry around than glass. And what Winsor Newton did, and this is an example from their historical archives, is they invented that screw top cap, which was really the final kind of invention along the road to the portability of paint tubes. This really just revolutionized the ability of artists to paint outside, and as I said, forever changed how landscape painting and painting in general was done from that point forward. We can see that in this landscape by Théodore Rousseau, Cows Descending the Hills at Sunset at the left, painted in 1860 to 1865. And again, kind of comparing it with an idyllic Arcadian landscape by a French artist, Pierre-Henri de Valenciennes, the classical landscape with figures and sculptures. They are completely different in their approach. Again, one is painted in an academic setting in a studio, whereas the Rousseau, he at least started outside, painting in the forest of Fontainebleau on the outside of Paris. He would finish the composition inside a studio, but it was important that he actually started outside and looked to nature directly. And I think that's probably a good moment to take a few minutes break. Okay, so part 2 of our marathon session, observing modern life. I think the whole concept of observing modern life is such a departure from where we've just come from and where we've been. And I always think when I tell people as we're going through the spaces, Monet is on every teacup and sweatshirt and everything around, and we don't think about he or his colleagues or contemporaries being radical at all because we're so used to it and saturated from how ubiquitous his artwork and everybody else's is around us. But they really did not receive that kind of praise or notoriety at all during their lifetime. And doing what they did, which was observing modern life, as we'll see, was such a departure from the staid traditions of the French Academy, of everything that came before them. They were just such a huge leap forward into the modern era that I feel it's important to remind ourselves and visitors just that it's such a departure, and it was so radical then. And even though, we're, as I said, we were so far with contemporary art and things that are looking completely different, that we don't think of it as that different now, but it really was. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as we walk through the second half of the session. So I wanted to start out with an artist who isn't traditionally, he didn't ever show with the Impressionist artists. He didn't consider himself an Impressionist, but hindsight is 20/20, and we look back and we call him kind of the grandfather of Impressionism. And this is Eugène Boudin. And we have a number of works by him that came in with the block collection and a few pictures from our own collection. The particular one I've got up here is the beach scene in Trouville. So Boudin was really the first artist who painted completely outside. So while the Barbizon painters like Rousseau and Diaz de la Peña and other artists in the gallery before that I didn't cover completely, while they may have started outside with their portable paint tubes, Boudin actually is out on that beach. And you see a difference immediately in not only the way he's communicating nature, but also the size of his works. They're all fairly small because he's out there on that beach with the paintings and an easel and those portable paint tubes painting away. And nothing really kind of gives you a sense more of that, just capturing modern life than these details that I pulled at the far right. The man in the top hat just turning as if he's acknowledging Boudin's presence, and the mother and the daughter at the bottom. Again, he's capturing them with such an economy of paint. It's such a difference in his application of brushwork, and I've got a detail coming up in a few slides from Bouguereau's application of paint. Boudin went to these resort towns in the south of France, in Trouville and Deauville. We've got two paintings of the port scenes of Deauville, and these were resort towns where the wealthy came and they had their picnics on the beach, and he just observed modern life and all its glories and all the screaming children. He was known as the King of the Skies. I think that's what that Corot called him. And Monet is really going to look back to him. And I actually got ahead of myself. One day when Boudin was on the beach sketching, he came across another young, very young artist who was out there sketching too. And I gave it away, but these are by Monet. So Boudin discovered Monet painting, or rather sketching, these caricatures of these people on the beach in Trouville and Deauville, and Boudin saw something there. He thought that Monet was wasting his time and his talents capturing these characters, although what a great hand he had. I mean, we think of him as painting such gestural, loose works, but he really was quite a skilled draftsman and able to capture kind of the character or the likeness of someone in a few deft strokes. So Boudin thought he was wasting his time and encouraged him to do something more, and thankfully he did. Monet, just a little bit about him before we get into some other works. Monet's mother really supported his artistic endeavors, but his father did not. He wanted Claude to join him in the family grocery business. When he was 17 years old, Claude's mother died, and he went to live with his aunt. And after a short stint in the army, his aunt encouraged him to attend a formal school in Paris, to which he agreed. So if it weren't for a nurturing aunt, and Boudin, we would not have Monet. And later on, Caillebotte also plays a large role in Monet's success, too. But it's this observations of modern life that really kind of start us out on our journey in the 19th century and the Impressionist, heading towards Impressionism. And as I said, Boudin was really the grandfather for painting outside, observing nature directly, and capturing what he saw, those people that were on the beach. Another artist who was really great at capturing modern life, and he was Pissarro had so many different styles. This is a relatively early work from 1876, The Garden of Les Maîtres at Pontoise. Pissarro was from Pontoise, and he painted early on with Cézanne outside. He had a brief stint trying his hand at prints. For a while, he kind of fell in with Seurat and Signac, and you see some points coming up at some point in his career. So he really he went in a lot of different directions, but this work is really unique for a few things. Number one, it's massive. It's really big for Pissarro rather. He painted usually on a much smaller scale because he was painting outside. And it's really an explosion of color, and it reveals kind of his interest in some of the burgeoning color theories that I'll talk about specifically with relationship to Seurat and Signac, but also Van Gogh, and this idea of complementary colors. And we see it in the foreground with that hedgerow of red and green flowers and foliage. The painting itself looks really blurry. I'm sorry, I thought that was a higher resolution image. The painting itself features a young woman he was friends with, Maria de Rheims, and like Pissarro, she was anti-establishment. Pissarro was an anarchist, and he just wanted nothing to do with anything that had any reason or ration or order or logic, and Maria de Rheims was similar, and she lived at this house with her sister, and she was, like her sister, she was unmarried and educated, which was a relatively rare thing during the period. And she was very vocal about women's rights, and in a time when you couldn't be vocal. And the leaders of the Freemasons heard her speak, and they adopted her as the first female Freemason. So she becomes a really important figure in history, and we see her catching her reflection in this gazing ball, this garden ball. I think it's really interesting, and it may just be me, but I see the reflection almost as a male figure in there, and I wondered if it was anything to do with Pissarro kind of projecting her image, because she's in many respects kind of assuming the role of a much more powerful figure than a woman had at that point. Garden balls were, of course, very common in that period as an ornament of one's garden. There are many thoughts about what their purpose was. Some are to reflect light. Some are to ward off evil spirits. Some believe that. But in this case, we know it's just capturing this reflection of a woman who was friends with Pissarro. She had organized tea parties, quote unquote, in her garden that were actually other revolutionaries that would gather on the grounds of this house, which still stands if you go to Pontoise. You can see it. And it really is just a tour de force of Pissarro's capturing modern life, his ability to render fabric and lush foliage with thick dabs of paint, and just capture that outdoor bright light in Pontoise. And this is probably the quintessential painting that captures modern life, and unfortunately it's still on loan to Denver right now. It's Monet's painting, The Boulevard de Capucines, from 1873-74. And I think I have a couple slides down the way a comparison with Bouguereau, but this is really only about 5 to 7 years after Bouguereau is painting at the height of his fame. I mean, Bouguereau is still painting, but this is why it's such a departure from the subject matter and the style and everything about it from the academic tradition. This particular painting really is celebrating and showing the new haussmanization of Paris. So previously, Paris had these very meandering, narrow streets, this medieval Paris, an example of that on the far right. And then with the haussmanization of Paris, the boulevards open up, wider thoroughfares, and Monet is really depicting that from a second-story window. He is in his friend, former studio of his friend Nadar, the photographer. He's looking out from that window, looking down on the street of the Boulevard de Capucines. And we know that Nadar's apartment was at 35 Boulevard de Capucines, so you can go there today and look out from that same vantage point. Monet is also looking at Japanese prints, and we know he collected Japanese prints along with Van Gogh and a lot of other artists. And as we get into Van Gogh a little bit later, Van Gogh's looking at sort of the flatness of the composition, but Monet is too. And this boulevard scene, this is the print that we know that he had in his collection, so he was very much aware of this. And I think he's kind of taking elements from Japanese prints and combining them in a way that feels new and is a complete departure from what had been done before. It was so radical, this painting at the time, that critics called it black tongue lickings. And that's, I think, a quote that we have in the label that we found that someone said after that he exhibited it. At the far right, and this is this detail with the brushwork, those are figures at the far right. And you can see how a critic could say black tongue lickings because they're just these very quick gestural marks that he's making. And there were these new chiseled brushes that became on the market, became available on the market, that really facilitated an artist being able to kind of go in with those chisel marks and do really quick brush strokes of paint. You can see the date, that's from 1886, but they had been on the market for about 10 or so more years, compared to the very detailed brushwork of Bouguereau at the left. And the term that I like to use for the type of brushwork that Bouguereau had is the licked finish. And I think about that ice cream cone when you're a kid and you don't want any marks of your tongue. You're just going to lick, 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 and so it's totally smooth all the way around. That is the academic style of brushwork. Hardly any trace of your hand at all. So it's that licked finish. Whereas with Monet, it's so gestural. It's that cat lick, that tongue lickings rather. It's completely the opposite. And again, that was what was so radical of a departure from what Bouguereau and the academics were doing to what Monet and his colleagues are doing. And this comparison with the Monet from the 1870s on the right and the Pissarro painted 20 years later really marks a huge change in sort of the acceptance of this type of image. Durand Ruel commissioned Pissarro to paint, they urged Pissarro to paint the Rue Saint-Honoré on the left, and by that point, street scenes were fashionable. So it took 20 years between Monet painting the boulevard on the right to Pissarro painting a similar street scene on the left for it to become an acceptable subject matter. Pissarro was also painting from a second-story window. We know at this point he had eye trouble late in his life, and so it was really hard for him to paint outside. So he was painting from inside and capturing the street scene from an elevated vantage point. And one of the details of the Monet that's so great is he captures these two figures at the far right. And again, in just such an economy of brushwork, that's the top-hatted gentleman at the right, and they are the quintessential French flaneurs, or the people who are looking down and observing daily life. That balcony vantage point, again, we're sort of around the corner from Nadar's studio, and that was the site of the very first Impressionist exhibition in 1874. That room right there, and Caillebotte organized it. So that first Impressionist exhibition featured a number of artists, including Monet, Manet, Degas, Cézanne, Morisot, Renoir, and it was the first time any artist exhibited outside of the Academy. So again, it was extremely radical, a huge departure from anything that had been, they were really rebels. They were criticized for their work, and they just thought, forget it, we're going to go together and we're going to become our own group, and they did. And as I said, it marks a huge turning point from that point forward, of artists who are going to just, Courbet did as well, that just go their own way and go in the opposite direction of the academic tradition, and try to secure their own patronage. Some of the other differences, too, if you think about the academics, they're painting for the wealthy classes, the people who have come from a long tradition of money, and the canvases, the academic paintings are much larger in scale, whereas many Impressionist pictures are smaller. They're thinking about who's going to be buying these pieces, and so it's a new merchant class. Their houses are smaller, many of them live in apartments. Impressionists are also painting outside, so it's a combination of their working methods and thinking about who's going to be buying their canvases that start to dictate the shift in the size of these compositions. And that was something that Caillebotte also had urged them to do, was to paint on a smaller scale, to think about who's going to be the new patrons of your work. Other sort of observations of modern life can really be mapped onto many of these other pictures that are in the galleries. The Boudin, the right, upper right, the Manet, all these ideas can sort of be grafted onto these pictures. So rounding the corner, we're going to look at the Caillebotte and the Morisot pictures, Observing Modern Life Still. And this is where a lot of the portraits are in this section of the gallery. A little sort of tidbit, the Renoir, Woman Leaning on Her Elbows, was the first picture, the first Impressionist picture that the Bloch family purchased in 1976. They actually dipped their toe in the water with Dutch first. They bought a painting that was attributed to Ruysdael, but it turned out to be a dubious attribution. And they got cold feet, and they pulled back. And Ted Coe came to them with this little painting by Renoir and said, "I think I've got something for you. Let's try again." And so they thankfully came back and they made this acquisition. And one of our researchers, Danny Hampton, has recently discovered that this painting is actually a study for a much larger composition of women playing badminton. And she's located the composition, and previous scholars thought that it was just a study that he dashed off, one of 100 or so every day, but it's actually a study for a much larger composition. So these discoveries and many more will be featured in our French paintings catalog, which I'm excited and a little bit nervous to announce. The first iteration will be launched this September with 16 works, so it will go live digitally. Caillebotte is a really interesting artist to consider, and until the major exhibition in Chicago, he was really underknown. We have, as you know, 2 paintings by him in our collection, and this picture is, I think, erroneously titled Portrait of Richard Gallo. It really is one of many compositions that Caillebotte painted of his friend Richard Gallo, and I think they're more kind of a genre piece, but back to those in a minute. Caillebotte was a fascinating individual. He came from money, and as such, he was a friend and supporter of the Impressionist. He paid for Monet's rent at one point in his life. He really was, as I said, the mastermind behind the first Impressionist exhibition, and was really getting those artists to think about marketing their work and to whom to market the pictures to. His father was in the textile industry, and almost all of his work have this amazing textile design in them, the couch, the pillows. I think it'd be a fascinating exhibition to do on the fabrics in Caillebotte's paintings, because they're just so lush and rich, and clearly he was fascinated by them. He was a boat builder, as we'll see in a minute, but he was also, most importantly for this composition, he built his own frames. This frame is one of the few original frames that are in this part of the collection. And I love how the design of the frame kind of echoes the wainscoting in the room of his studio in the back of the painting. And this painting, the frame, is done in a metal leaf. So if those of you, if you think about a gold leaf frame, it's much brighter, it's sort of more of a lemon gold. This is a metal leaf, sort of a bronze leaf, which tarnishes, it gets much darker. So when Roger Ward saw this frame many, many years ago, it was so dark, he thought that he should get a new frame for it, but thankfully he held on to it because he, as any good scholar knows, scholarship evolves and changes. So when we realized that this painting actually was in its original frame, we were able to switch back and put that original frame on it after giving it a good cleaning. It will continue to darken over time, so we will have to occasionally clean it. But for the most part, Impressionists hated gold frames. For them, gold meant bourgeois, gold signaled French Academy. It was everything that they were trying to get as far away from as possible. So many of the artists of the period designed their own frames, including Degas, and we have an original frame around our Milners, and I wish I had a picture of it, but it's a white frame. And we're actually thinking now about framing for our pastel, the rehearsal of the ballet. But frames were really important for many of these artists. As I said, they were really trying to go as far away in the opposite direction from the French Academy, and gold to them signaled the landed aristocracy or the bourgeois that were buying it. So they wanted very simple frames, very modern, very sleek frames. So why is it that almost all of the French paintings are in these French frames? These artists would just roll over in their graves. Well, the dealers of the next generation, like the Wildensteins and Durand-Ruel, were thinking also about the pocketbook, and they were thinking, well, who's going to buy these paintings? They're going to expect gold frames. And so they threw out the sleek, modern, white or green frames that the Impressionists designed, and they put on these gold French Louis XV style frames. So it's just this cycle. It just sort of, it just kills me to think about all those frames that they tossed out. But one of the recipes that they had, they weren't just straight gold frames. They would distress them a little bit. And if you look at frames around the Morisot, the Renoir boy, and the Manet girl, they look like they've been whitewashed, and in fact they have been. So the dealers, Wildenstein, had a recipe called soda ash and red dust or pink dust. And what they would do is they would take a Louis XV style gilt frame, and they would put a layer of soda on it, which is caustic, and it would eat away at the gold. And then they would add this pink dust from cement. My old chief curator in Detroit, who was nuts about frames, said that it was sort of like the equivalent of acid washing the frame. He called them pickled frames. But that was the fashion at the time in the early part of the 20th century to faux or to sort of take off the shininess of the gilding and create these frames. So you see these frames again and again and again on these 19th century pictures. So as I said, this portrait, not a portrait of Richard Gallo, exists in many iterations, and he was really a good friend of Caillebott's. As you can see, he depicted him many times, and because he depicted him so many times in different roles, I feel it's more of a genre scene than a straight portrait. And he really uses him as a model to explore kind of different facets of a type or of a personality. Here we have Gallo, who was a newspaperman, sitting on the couch reading the rival newspaper, that Le Figaro, that's on his lap. Morisot is another artist who's in that sort of section of the gallery, and this painting features her daughter Julie, and many of her pictures are of her daughter Julie, and we have to think about a woman impressionist access to subject matter, just like I talked about the other day with Vigée Lebrun and L'Abbé Guillard and Rose de Creux, who were able to get into the Academy. Their access to subject matter was limited based on the restrictions of the Academy. Similarly, Morisot didn't have as ready access to male models, and so she painted what was appropriate for a woman painter at that time, her own daughter. So we see Julie underneath the orange tree, and what I wanted to talk about, you can see a glimpse of that pickled gold frame at the bottom, but I wanted to highlight a detail that we recently discovered in this work was along that bottom edge. You see all those dark green dots and that sort of band that's lighter? Though the dark green dots are holes where she had tacked up the painting to work on it. And it had previously been stretched on a smaller canvas, but then we realized at a certain point that it had been unfolded, and then up until about a year ago, it was recently part of a major Morrisseau exhibition, but someone, a conservator, had toned in that bottom layer to match the rest of the composition. So it was the same dark green as what's above it. But Morrisseau worked from the center of her composition outwards. And so often the edges of her canvases were not finished at all, including our own portrait of Julie under the tree. So I thought that it was appropriate to remove that overpaint and see the original kind of edge of that canvas in its frame. There's a great essay, the catalog we have in the library, and the painting has been cleaned as part of being part of this exhibition. Morrisseau, of course, has connections to the Rococo period, and her brushwork is evocative of that just rich, lush paint handling of Bouguereau and Fragonard, and her palette is much lighter than a lot of these other artists, and she really was influential for Manet. She was married to his brother, and she encouraged Manet to paint outside, to get outside more and to stop using so much black. And so he took note, and in fact, I think that this is an example of a female artist having a major impact on a male artist. Tubes, trains, and technology. So these accord with the theme panels that are in the gallery, and so we kind of move around the gallery in this way. In the 19th century, there was a number of new pigments that were manufactured, including chrome yellow and viridian green. These were utilized, we see these that show up in Monet and Van Gogh's canvases, so these brighter pigments, these, as opposed to organic compounds, these are things that are manufactured. And artists are starting to use poppy oil as a binder in portable metal paint tubes that extends the life of that paint, so they're painting outside, and they don't want something that's going to dry really quick, so they put in this poppy seed oil so it extends the life of that paint, so they can work it up and get wet on wet brush strokes, which is, again, going to be something that's a hallmark of Impressionist artists. A number of artists that we kind of associate with using some of this technology, Guillemin, Pissarro, Monet, and Sisley. These are all artists who are traveling to some of the destinations to paint. They're going to tourist destinations. They're using rail to get there. Guillemin is a great example, a really sort of underknown artist. And he was good friends with Pissarro and Cézanne early on, but he was so poor. He worked many jobs, one of which was for the railway, and another was for the sort of the sewage system of France. So because he worked for the rail, he was able to get out and paint in all these different locations outside of Paris. Most of the time, though, he was working during the day and painting in the dusk. So a lot of his compositions are, again, they don't look radical to us now, but they are very colorful. And in many ways, I feel like he was influential to some of the Fauve painters later on. Matisse sees his work in 1895, and if you look at Matisse's work prior to 1895, it's very dark. He sees Guillemin's work and Russell's work and a picture of Van Gogh's, and his palette immediately shifts. So I really think that Guillemin plays a role in some of this shift to using brighter and brighter colors. The Sisley on the bottom, this was Henry Bloch's favorite painting. Again, these colors in here are extremely bright and really saturated, that sort of reveal the artist working outside directly. They link to England. This is painted after the artist had been to England and seen works by Constable. Back to this boat in Caillebotte for a minute. As I said, Caillebotte is really not a household name. Thanks to the Art Institute of Chicago's exhibition a few years ago on Caillebotte, he's more well-known, but he's still relatively underknown and underappreciated in this country. And it's fairly unusual for a collection to have one example, let alone two paintings. And we are really fortunate that we have this painting that came in with Henry and Marion's bequest. This is a painting of a boat moored on the Seine at Argenteuil. And as I said, Caillebotte was a boat builder, and we are in the process of narrowing down which particular boat this was. He had a boat named Roast Beef, and we just recently discovered that this is not roast beef, but it is one of the boats that he made. And he could have painted any kind of composition. We think about Impressionist painting leisure scenes, and this is leisure until we get to that background and we see that smokestack in the background. So artists like Caillebotte, and it's hard to see, but in the background, actually many of these pictures, they're including scenes of industry. So they're mixing and reflecting kind of what's happening in France at the time, that industry is kind of starting to creep in, and it's no longer this idyllic kind of countryside, but there's a presence of industry, which for the Impressionists is a signal of modernity and something that they wanted to make sure that you were aware of, and they're telegraphing that in their work by including elements of technology. Here is a detail of that absolutely lush brushwork and that wet-on-wet paint. You see that in the mixing of the blue and the white pigments in the sort of the foreground. He's not letting one application of paint dry completely before he's switching over to white pigments. The science of art and color. Here we're going to get into some of the pointillists and talk about color, and also Van Gogh. Van Gogh was, the more I read his letters, the more he had such a visual memory, and he just was voracious in everything he did. He was a voracious reader, a voracious letter writer. He had a visual memory that he saw something and he just forever just stored it in there, and his recall was amazing. All of his letters are online, so if anybody ever wants a good read, just start from the 1870s and read all the way through. He was fascinated by color theory, in particular Charles Blanc's Color Wheel. A show that we're working on that opens this fall is a deep dive into our Van Gogh olive trees, and it really focuses on the science of color and Van Gogh's understanding of color, but with specific relationship to that painting, it's about color fade and color loss. So Van Gogh's looking at this color wheel, and he's looking at the opposites, or the colors opposite the spectrum, and he's putting those colors in his composition right next to each other. So he's putting red and green next to each other, so those are diagonal on Blanc's color wheel. Orange and blue, purple and yellow. He even had a box of string, and this is his box that's at the Van Gogh Museum. It's an actual Chinese lacquered box that had these strings, and he would play with the string. He would hold it up next to each other to see what that color would look like next to each other. He was really interested in what he called the simultaneity of color, so that idea of these colors kind of having an effect on one another, but causing this reverberation in your eye to kind of come alive. And once you look at this wheel of color and you know those relationships that Van Gogh was really trying to emulate, you see it again and again and again in his compositions. Blue and red, blue and orange, red and green, purple and yellow, over and over again. And you might not think about it at first when you see his early portraits from his Noonan period. This is probably you can see it a little bit more clearly. And people initially thought, oh, he doesn't get it yet. He's not painting it. But what he was doing at this point is he's mixing the colors. So you see her cap is red and her cloak is green. He's mixing them with other pigments, so they're not pure. When he gets to Paris in the middle, Paris period, the restaurant Rissball, and then of course in Saint-Remy, and then afterwards, he starts to use pure color. So that's why we go from these kind of muddy earlier pictures in Noonan or the Netherlands to more of a pure application of color that we get when he's in Paris and then later in Saint-Remy. And I'll come back to Van Gogh in a second. Seurat is, of course, an artist that we think of with relationship to his understanding of science and color, and the term is pointillism. I try to not use too many of those isms, but of course it's an artist that's painting in those dots and then allowing your eye to mix those colors from farther back. And we get a great sense of that in this detail of his brushwork at the far right. And Van Gogh didn't have time for that. He looked at it for a while and he thought it was a fad, and he just thought, it's not for me. But what's really interesting, I mean, so these are two details. This is the olive tree. Van Gogh is separating his brushstrokes into individual colors of pure color, but it's different, as you can see, from what Seurat is doing. Seurat is really more into the science of optics and mixing colors on the canvas, whereas Van Gogh is painting directly solid strokes of that color, one next to each other. And you see that red and green, which are on that color wheel, that are right next to each other. Again, some other paintings that you can apply some of these ideas onto of color theory. Signac is an artist that was painting like Seurat, with that pointillist, those dots. Van Gogh lived with him for a while and tried it a little bit. You can see that influence in the restaurant wristball. His is probably his closest to pointillism. But as I said, he tried it and he went off the path in his own direction. And Pissarro, even to a degree, does it in this late painting of Poplar's The Sunset at Rogny. Take a look at that now, because it's about to come off view, because the Gauguin Fataruma just came back from London. New locations, French art, 1870 to 1900. So we're going to have Gauguin and Cézanne here. And Gauguin, of course, was never happy anywhere. He was constantly on a quest to find what he thought was going to make him happy, going to Brittany, as we have here, and then later to Tahiti. In the willow tree canvas here, he was fleeing what he felt was overly civilized and decadent environment of Paris to what he was trying to get back to, a kind of a simpler lifestyle. And he felt that Brittany and these Breton peasants, that was the place. Unlike the Impressionists, Gauguin did not aim to objectively reproduce the natural world. Rather, through a careful synthesis of exaggerated line, form, and color, he strove to capture the essence of his subjects as filtered through his own perceptions. And here we have a detail of these peasants at the far right. I'll come back to that in a second. They're very important for a painting that is going to be new in the galleries. Here we have the Fataruma, and briefly, this is in his Tahitian period. He's mixing elements of Western dress, and here we have this, what's known as the Mother Hubbard dress that this Tahitian woman is wearing, which is from the West. The rocker that she sits on is also from the West. She's got a wedding band on, another sort of sign of the West influence all the way in Tahiti. So again, he's trying to go to different places to get to that untapped kind of sensibility of people, and he doesn't ever quite find it. In order to emphasize the exoticness of his subject, he gave the painting a Tahitian title, Fataruma, which roughly translates to melancholic. There's a painting very similar to this that is called Melancholy, that's at the Worcester Art Museum that Gauguin did. And quickly, even though this isn't a far-flung place like Tahiti or Brittany, place was very important for Cézanne as well. Mont Saint-Victoire is a place in Aix-en-Provence, which is where Cézanne was from. He painted Mont Saint-Victoire over 60 times. So for Cézanne, it really becomes this kind of sentinel for him. It's home. Even though he was married and his wife stayed up in Paris, he kept going back down to Aix-en-Provence, either to paint Mont Saint-Victoire or the quarry at Bébémès, which is about to go out on loan. Now, on the left is a painting that you may recall from the recent acquisitions exhibition that Catherine did about a year and a half ago. It's Émile Bernard's portrait of his grandmother. And I wanted to talk just for a minute about portraiture during this period. The Noonan period picture by Van Gogh in the center and the Gauguin picture of Fataruma at the far right. Émile Bernard painted 3 pictures of his grandmother, and the one at the far right is one that I acquired about 6 months after I arrived. It was a really exciting moment. I was in New York at a conference, and I knew that painting was coming up at auction. And Bernard kind of completes the group of the Pontevin artists along with Van Gogh and Gauguin and a few others, and it was someone we didn't have in the collection. I was at a conference, and I was supposed to go to these sessions, but I ditched it and ran down to the New York Public Library to get the catalog raisonné and realized that he painted 2 other compositions. One is in the Van Gogh Museum in the center, and then a third is at the MFA Boston. And Van Gogh loved the composition so much in the center that he traded him one of his own portraits, a self-portrait that's in Detroit, for the one in the center. And the fact that this third one was coming up at auction, we didn't have it, and it was a really extremely low estimate, made me want to look twice at it. So I called up a friend who's a conservator. We took it out of its frame, and it was totally a wreck. It was totally, completely varnished over in yellow. But once we took it out of its frame, I saw the borders, and the borders were so bright. I knew that it would clean up really well. It was on its original unlined canvas, and I just got goosebumps thinking about it. So the next day was the phone bid, and we got it, obviously, and let's just say for hundreds of thousands of dollars less than what he goes for today, because I think that they didn't know what they had, and it was I was at the right place at the right time. So I appreciate Julian for trusting me 6 months into my job. So portraiture, for a quick second, was something that was really important to Van Gogh and something he was thinking about as a way for the future. He really put a lot of stock in it. It was something that he was going to pursue with Gauguin when they formed the Studio of the South. They actually had invited Bernard, but things were growing a little tense, and Bernard didn't have enough money to go down there, so it was just Gauguin and Van Gogh. But this quote, the portrait, that's something old, one might say, but it's also brand new. I'm really kind of interrogating that idea and looking at how much Van Gogh, Gauguin, and Bernard looked to the past to create their style moderne. And we can see it again and again and again, and it's a project I'm working on, and I'll just show you briefly some of these connections to the old masters. When Van Gogh saw Bernard's portrait of his grandmother, who plays a huge role in his life, and you'll see a label that I'm about to write for this when it goes out on view in a few weeks. She encouraged him when his parents didn't. She was a formidable woman, as you could tell. She was the laundress. She was known as the laundress of Lille. And when he painted her, the first thing that Van Gogh said was, "You've never been closer to Rembrandt, old fellow." And in fact, Bernard was looking at Rembrandt. And so there are these affinities between what they're trying to do and moving forward, but also what they're taking from the past. Durer was an influence to Gauguin. Van Gogh is looking at Durer and Rembrandt, as well as Hals. And so it's an exhibition that I'm working on right now called Van Gogh and the Art of the Past, the Model for the Modern Portrait. There's been a few studies of people that are looking at some of these connections, but to date, no one has ever looked at his time in London, the influence of Holbein. So I think that there's something there, and it's something to keep in mind, that these artists are not just looking forward, but they're also looking back to the past. Van Gogh was influenced by Bernard's portrait and some affinities with Rembrandt here. Van Gogh paints this old Arlésienne when he's got the grandmother in his own collection. And then we're going to move forward to modern. I've only got a half an hour left. Toward modern art. So we're crossing the threshold into the modern collection. And this is sort of the different bays of that space. One of the most important things that really shifts our understanding of modern art is the Armory Show. It's in New York in 1913, and it included Matisse, Picasso, Marcel Duchamp. You can see these are installation shots, Brancusi. It was absolutely revolutionary. So it was revolutionary as the Impressionists kind of breaking out on their own to have the first Impressionist exhibition. This was a step even further, and it was like the Impressionist exhibition, met with critics far and wide who just could not believe it. They thought that the world was going to end. It was like Chicken Little. All the criticism was just like the sky is falling. They couldn't believe that art was heading in this direction. Unhinged from reality, it just was, nobody was ready for it. There was, on the 100th anniversary in 2013, a recreation of the Armory Show. I encourage you to find that catalog because it has a fascinating history of kind of the reception of the original show and kind of the post-history of those pictures afterwards. The comic at the right's a little bit blurry, but one of the quintessential works that was in that exhibition was Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase. Again, I mean, what a departure from Bouguereau. We're so far away from that, but we're farther away from Van Gogh and Gauguin and artists who were, at the end of the 1890s painting also. And the critics just picked up on that. They couldn't believe this is a figure in motion. And, that fracturing of the picture plane really was something that, as I said, they weren't ready for at all. There were 1,400 works in the Armory show that really presented a who's who of avant-garde artists. So in addition to Picasso and Matisse, Van Gogh was actually in the show as well. And as I said, it was a tour de force for modernism. Heading in that direction are two very different paintings by Pierre Bonnard, one that is on the earlier side of the space with Van Gogh and Gauguin. It's the Still Life with Guelder Roses from 1892, but it was reworked in 1929, so two very different kind of approaches to that canvas. And on the right, much later, the Bonnard's White Cupboard. And they're two completely different styles of painting. When you look up close to the Bonnard flowers, Bernard was a member of the Nabi group, so that he's really influenced by pattern and form. Some of that reworking, he's gone back in and added these yellow highlights or dots on top of those Guelder roses. The Nabi produced intimate paintings of domestic subjects in a flat, decorative style that was heavily influenced by Japanese art and Paul Gauguin. When Bonnard started the still life, he emphasized the surface pattern and the simplified, flattened forms, but as I said, nearly 40 years later, he went back in and his style had become much more painterly. He added those brushstrokes of pale yellow. The modern composition in 1931, this was Marion Bloch's favorite painting, by the way, it hung in their dining room, is so modern. I really want the museum shop to do that table square as a scarf. I just love it. Their primary colors he's using, red, yellow, and blue, and the simple and vertical and horizontal lines create this quiet domestic scene. We see his wife Met, who he has depicted many, many times. And what we don't really notice at first is the geometry of the picture. Again, those horizontals, those verticals, but also that it's a night scene. That little element at the top left is a light, so it indicates that it's painted at night. Bonnard was a former attorney, and he paints with feeling and from memory rather than seeking to reproduce faithfully what he saw. Moving on to Matisse, as you all know, this is the first Matisse to enter the collection due to the early restrictions that Nelson placed on the collection that we couldn't acquire anything by an artist who hadn't been dead more than 30 years. That really hogtied our ability to collect artists like Matisse, who was still living when we started the museum in 1933. We even had to have petitions for the Van Gogh olive trees as well as the Monet water lilies, just to give you a sense of how difficult it was to acquire works that we now today take for granted. Matisse was part of the Fauve group, known for the bright colors, known as Fauves are the wild beasts. What I love about this composition is that reading kind of the backstory into it, it was a particularly dark moment in Matisse's life and in world history. It's World War II, Matisse, although he could have left France, he decided to stay because of a sense of he wanted to be supportive of his country. He'd recently been divorced. He was extremely lonely. Other than the company of a few of these female models, he was really all by himself because everybody else who could leave had left. As I said, he was also coming out of a period of intense sickness. He had stomach cancer, and so it was just a really dark period for him, both individually and collectively for the nation. And yet this painting is so joyous, and the color pattern and the shapes and everything about it is very bold. And I particularly love the detail of the arabesques that he's gone back into the background and scratched with the back of his brush while the paint is still wet. So it's that patterning and that form that is sort of a thread that we can pull forward from the Nabi and Bonnard. And I put question mark after toward the modern because to kind of continue in the vein that I've started early on with Gainsborough and a lot of artists looking back to the Dutch artist, and Van Gogh included, Mondrian was no exception. Many of us think of Mondrian's work at the right, and we know it for that really modernist, reductive, primary colors, only horizontals and verticals. But of course, this is an early work of his that we have on the left, this Stammer Mill with Streaked Sky. To give you a sense of the evolution of how he kind of got from more representational to abstract, you can really see it in his series of trees, really kind of starting from the top left, kind of going, and he just breaks down farther and farther and farther those tree branches to where they all only are that horizontal and that vertical. But thinking back about our own Mondrian, it is a copy after a Ruysdael painting. And the primary difference, though, is that if you look at the blades of Ruysdael's windmill, they're on a diagonal. But if you know anything about Mondrian and Theosophy, they absolutely did not believe in the diagonal at all. It had to be vertical and horizontal. So he changed the blade, the direction of those blades. But he's still kind of looking at that formula for the Dutch landscape. That 2/3 sky is still somewhat present, although his palette is much more limited than Ruysdael's. It's these bands of color. And if ever we were talking about a frame, this is a painting that really does need a new frame. It's screaming for a new frame. Anxiety and alienation. These are some of the changes in the European society as we think about what's happening that is going to influence and impact the art that is created. A lot of change happening in the Industrial Revolution, as I talked about earlier, is luring workers to the cities, and it breaks apart rural communities and connections to farm, and most important for art purposes, it breaks apart that connection to nature. Many people are spending long hours in factories, and they're feeling displaced and alienated, which calls for reform. So much like we had during the Barbizon era and the Peasants' Revolt, we're having another series of revolts, and artists like Ernst Barlach and some of the German expressionists, you see those forms of revolt kind of percolating up through their work. We also had the eruption of World War I that is right on the threshold there, 1914 to 1918, and there's a seismic shift that influenced the arts. And the German expressionists really explored these shifts through the power of line and color. Briefly, we have Kirchner and Nolde, and again, we're so far from where we've come from with the traditional kind of commission portraits. These are really coming more into, as I said, the power of line and expression and color. Kirchner elongated the features of this poet, of his friend, the expressionist poet Simon Gutmann, in a manner reminiscent of stylized African masks. He's wearing unusually colorful clothing and is seated in a chair draped with boldly patterned Indonesian batik fabric. And he's holding an open Japanese umbrella in the background. He was a member of the Dresden-based group Die Brücke, or the Bridge, and he was seeking to re-energize what they felt was the tired academic art of the past. And so he's incorporating these bold colors and forms and kind of distorting that figure. Nolde used brushwork and intense colors to reveal what he called the elemental force of the objects that he had studied at the Berlin Museum of Ethnology. And I want to move forward to keep allowing for some questions at the end. Some other paintings, I mentioned the Barlach, that you can map some of these ideas of anxiety and alienation. And if there are any Beckmann fans, I urge you to go to St. Louis. They have a huge collection of works by Max Beckmann for you to see. Rejecting reason and order, I put Kay Sage with Eve Tanguy because, of course, they were married in real life as well. So they were romantically linked, but they were also artistically inclined and linked together. Kay Sage had a lot of money, and she was a friend of the Surrealist artists, but many of them didn't like her for the fact that she had money. They called her a princess. She shrugged that off, though, and continued to paint with them. When Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939, in the beginning of World War II, She sailed back to the United States, and she was trying to set up plans to bring other surrealists over, including Tanguy. They didn't marry until 1940, but she was had already fallen in love, and she was trying to get him back over to the United States and to really promote his career. She got him a solo show at the Pierre Matisse Gallery, and they married in 1940, as I said. And she really started doing the bulk of her mature work after she returned to the States, as this canvas from 1943 suggests. Unfortunately, Yves Tanguy died from a cerebral hemorrhage in 1955, so they weren't married for very long. Too Soon for Thunder is a desolate landscape filled with enigmatic architectural motifs and draped skeletal phantoms. Of a similar image, Sage remarked, "It's a sort of showing what's inside things, half mechanical, half alive. The mountain itself can represent almost anything a human life, the world, any fundamental thing. I do know that while I'm painting, I feel as though I am living in that place." I can't imagine living in that kind of a landscape. It feels very desolate. Whereas Tanguy was starting from that place of sort of strangeness. He's got these organic forms that are sort of dripping, and I see a lot of, Dali in his work. You see that kind of, they're really all working from this idea of the unconscious and what's going to kind of come out of that unconscious thought and sensibility. To the left in his canvas is an imaginative array of stacked shapes that reference human shapes or animal bodies. And as I said, he and other surrealists were really trying to tap into that unconscious. They were inspired by Freud's psychoanalytic theories, and they depicted images from their dreams, nightmares, and memories. And to kind of wrap things up, I wanted to kind of bring back in some of the earlier works to show some similarities and differences of where we've come and where we're going. With Brancusi's Rejecting Reason and Order, this is a portrait, but actually in an extremely reductive form. This unconventional portrait of Nancy Cunard captures her erect posture, prominent forehead, and receding chin of her subject in a simplified manner that also conveys her elegance. The artist met Nancy Cunard, a shipping heiress in Paris. She was a jazz lover and poet, and the owner and publisher of Hours Press. She was also an outspoken political activist fighting racism and later fascism. Brancusi studied sculpture in Bucharest and Munich before moving to Paris, and he actually studied with Rodin. From the beginning, Brancusi paid attention to the basis of his sculpture, designing all of them because he felt that they were essential components in the work of art. But both of these were commissioned works of art, so they both, the Hoppner, as we saw earlier, and the Brancusi, had to please that sitter. And I just think it's so interesting to see how the artist would adopt and adapt not only to who was commissioning the work, but also to the realities of their artistic sort of milieu. That we've come so far with these forms, with Brancusi, they're now reductive, and yet we still know that that's a portrait. We can see elements of her body there. I also wanted to compare these two bathers, Jacques Lipchitz on the left and Jules Dalou on the right. Again, we're dealing with a fractured picture plane and thinking about different facets and points of breaking down that figure and form into different facets. Lipchitz believed that the artist's role is to focus on visual concepts, specifically the analysis of form and space. Here, he's translating those organic curves of a body into these abstract arrangement of geometric planes and angles. At the same time, the sculpture suggests the physics of motion and presents the human body as a modern mechanized creature. And I love this, when you move around it, it really does feel like it's sort of moving with you, and you can see it from multiple angles. And I feel like those facets create the sense of movement because it's as if you're looking at it at the same time from all these different angles, in complete contrast to the very classically inspired academic work by Jules Dalou. I wanted to talk for a second about perspective, and I'll go quickly, but as we think all the way back to the Renaissance and to, in fact, the medieval period, how far we've come with that development of perspective and how that kind of ripples through and influences and impacts artists from the Renaissance and medieval period forward. At the very top is Ghiberti's north door from the baptistry, and it really is evocative of that medieval style of perspective where everything is on one level, very shallow sense of space, or no sense of space really, shallow carving, and really no or limited sense of perspective. With the Gates of Paradise that was in 1425, that's a detail of the Jacob and Esau panel, he's figured out one-point perspective, and it's really from that point forward that we see the Renaissance artists being able to kind of present a three-dimensional space in a two-dimensional form. In the case of Brancusi, or rather Ghiberti, it's obviously three-dimensional because it's sculpture, but the same elements that he's communicating in the bronze doors, artists are picking up and doing in their two-dimensional canvases. So that sense of coming into the space, into a space that recedes back into depth, and all lines converge onto one point. In the modern era, Juan Gris and Lionel Feininger really break apart that sense of perspective, and they present multiple facets of a picture plane. And it really sort of serves to disorient the viewer, giving us multiple points of access, but it also speaks to movement and motion. It lends a sense of flatness to the work. So instead of creating a sense of depth, which is what Ghiberti was really striving for, and all these Renaissance artists afterwards, it does just the exact opposite. So we'll see things like Juan Gris' inclusion of text or words in his picture plane. That also serves to really flatten that composition. So we're coming kind of full pendulum from medieval, shallow space, Renaissance sense of one-point perspective, and really getting into that picture plane, back to the flatness, which Juan Gris, Feininger, and other cubists are kind of taking forward to signal a new era of approach to space. And I think this is my last slide, so we've got a few minutes afterwards for questions. I wanted to talk about Joseph Albers for a minute. Albers, of course, is so influential to artists of the next generation. This is homage to the square red brass from 1961. Coming over from Germany, he teaches in the States, Black Mountain College, and then at Yale. And I'd say probably one of his most important legacies is the development of the color theory, the interaction of color, which is a 1963 text that he wrote, and there's an image of it on the right, one of the pages from it. And he's really exploring those relationships of color and what they do optically with our eye in color mixing, which forms kind of recede into space, which forms come forward, and building off of things that Van Gogh was looking at with those kind of simultaneity of colors and theory, and how these colors, when certain colors are put next to each other, how it creates movement, how it creates, as I said, things kind of coming into space, receding back into space. It really is a legacy that is still taught in academies and art schools today, is his sense of color. I think that we should stop there so you have a few minutes to answer any questions, or I hopefully can answer some questions. Sure.